also the increasing diversity in an institutional sense of women, of the disabled, the elderly. So this, it also increases in voting, which is another way to do good planning. Get people into office who are going to be take into account the people who should, a fuller range of people into planning. So it's done a very interesting project on bringing out the vote and making sure that lower income people who traditionally don't vote, vote more. So it's had a lovely sort of competitions fun. And then going to City Hall all the time. They're a group that's always in the face of the municipal councillors. They wear peach scarves and are very known, and they're there making deputations in favor of lower public transit costs, of better housing. And so it has contributed to better planning in the city. It's contributed to better planning because they're continually making themselves very, very clear in Ottawa, and therefore they tend, over time, the city has done a number of things, a number of very interesting things, including the joint work on the plan on training the city staff to be more aware of social diversity. What I didn't say for them, and should have, the cross-sectoral partners in the case of the City of Ottawa, the universities, the community agencies, community-based women's groups. And I was going to make the comment to link it to what was said about the importance in the context of UN Habitat of getting the universities into a partnership with the community. In Ottawa, we have indeed very strong partnerships between the university. These two projects in which I'm engaged in, the universities are full. We do research for the projects. We get research grants and do them on the city. So I think it's a very important, I like that very much. It's in the way, I think it's a very important link between universities. We have university expertise, but what we really have is students. We have students, the professors are minor figures. It's the students who count because they all want to do, there's a huge interest in doing research that matters, in doing research that's actually going to change something. We have these lots of students, they all have to do theses, major papers, dissertations, all kinds of things. And so that they are an enormous resource to be used in ways that they want to do, and we want them to do, and the city wants them to do. So it's a lovely partnership. The other one now is Youth Futures, which is increasing post-secondary education for marginalized youth. It participates in what I would argue is the planning of the City of Ottawa. It is related to the whole question of how do you eliminate poverty in the City of Ottawa. You eliminate poverty by making sure that people who are marginalized get access to higher education and give opportunities. It is important to the City of Ottawa staffing, because as you bring in more people who then are capable of understanding the city and wanting to work for the city, it's actually had an impact on the way the population sees, just to give one small example, sees who works in the parks in Ottawa. 10 years ago, people who worked in the parks were about 99.9% white. And through this program, which is about 80% non-white, there are now people working in the parks. And now it has a fact, now the people they go into a park and they see somebody who looks like them and they say, there must be a job around here. I've got to find out, I can figure out how to get this job. But so it's been wonderful for the planning of City of Ottawa staffing, and responsible, the city's services, the cities of Ottawa claim that one of its major preoccupations is to respond to the demographic changes. One of the huge demographic changes is increased diversity in the population. So this program actually helps the City of Ottawa to achieve its planning goals. which is to try and figure out how you change services to suit this new demographic. The cross-sectoral partnerships in this case are City of Ottawa, Ottawa Community Housing, post-secondary sector, community agencies, community-based ethnocultural groups, and recent immigration groups. And again, very different. I like this example of the partners because they're very different. If I go back to my idea of how this helps with planning, there's very different sectors. Obviously, Ottawa Community Housing is a landlord in this case, but it's also a big housing operation. And so it brings this housing thing to this program into the city. The post-secondary are all the colleges and universities and some private actors. Oh, sorry, I'll just go back one. Okay. Well, I should say, why does this require social equality? Yeah, okay, that's, thank you. Sorry. So, to go back to my question, why does this require, because it requires good planning, and I think I've tried to give these two examples of where I think the planning has been improved because you've brought in people who have, who are seeking greater social equality, and that has stretched, that has improved the planning process in Ottawa. It's brought in more people, it's brought in new ideas, and it's brought in a wider range of this discussion. I thought was very interesting, the question that was asked about how do you help community good food, access to good food, and yet there's all kinds of worries about if people say, well, I don't know that I eat anything from that neighborhood because it's probably is going to do more to poison me than to feed me. I think the more people you can bring into this discussion, both people learn from the discussion, but also they bring forward good points of view. So I think these two programs, one of which is really focused on some of the lower income recent immigrant populations living in public housing, and so their view of what needs to be done to improve their life. City for All Women is looking at families and children and how can we ensure that the children who are growing up with less resources can think of ways that they should be growing up with more resources. And so my basic point is good planning requires social equality and partnership, and therefore sustainable urbanization is all about, for me, social equality and partnerships. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Andrew. Following on the theme of community participation, I'm delighted to introduce our next speakers, who will be Jonathan Barnett and Joe Barrage. They're going to play a tag team on this particular presentation. Just quickly, Jonathan Barnett, who you see in front of you, is Emeritus Professor of Practice in City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania. He also was, for a time, the Chief Urban Planner of New York City, where he undertook, among other things, the design of Battery Park City. He is an architect, a planner, an educator, the author of numerous books on practice in city design. He holds a degree from Yale and also from the University of Cambridge, is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and also of the American Institute of Certified Planning. Among Jonathan Barnett's many visiting professorships is a recent guest professorship at Southeast University in Nanjing. So having in some ways defined urban planning in North America, he is now been exposed to the process in China. an author of numerous books. Professor Barnett's recent publication, and I mean recent, just hot off the press, is one that he co-authored with Larry Beasley, the former chief planner of Vancouver, called Eco-Designs for Cities and Suburbs. Jonathan's books include City Design, Modernist, Traditional, Green, and Systems Perspective in 2011, and Smart Growth in a Changing World in 2007. Joining Professor Barnett on the platform will be Joe Berridge. Joe Berridge is a partner at Urban Strategies, which is arguably the premier urban planning design firm in Canada. And Joe has had an integral role in the development of some of the largest and most complex urban regeneration projects here in Canada, in the US, in the UK, and in Asia. Joe was the strategic planner for the development of Manchester's city centre, Toronto's Exhibition Place, a master planner for the waterfronts in Toronto, in Singapore, in Cork, Ireland, London's East Docklands, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Governor's Islands in New York, among others. I should note too that Urban Strategies has done a number of campus master plans, University of Waterloo, Queen's, Western University, and more recently has just won Ottawa Urban Design Award for their master plan for the University of Ottawa campus. And if anyone's interested in seeing it, I'll make that available. So I'm very delighted to welcome both of these individuals to the platform. What they are going to discuss is one of the more characteristic aspects of urban planning in North America, namely community participation. So with that, I introduce Jonathan Barnett.
Thank you, Ben, for that generous and I must say slightly exaggerated introduction.
Abridged is one.
Caroline, Andrew has stressed how different North America is from most places in both China and Africa. And community participation, I think, is pretty much embedded in traditions here. And I think you, for people from other countries or working in these other countries, are going to have to use your own judgment as to just how relevant community participation really is to the cultures in your countries. Yes, let's go. Okay. Town meeting tradition is one of the ancestors of community participation in the United States. In a town meeting, everybody in the community, and this of course has to be a pretty small town, actually turns out for a meeting, as you can see in this case in the high school gymnasium, and they vote on everything. The budget for the town, so there's going to be a new school building, whatever the issues are in front of the town. Everybody who's a voter in the community is encouraged to participate and come and decide. Now, as communities get bigger, you get what we call a representative town meeting, in which it's sort of like a city council, except that the districts for the town meeting members are much smaller. So you tend to know everybody who's a town meeting representative. And people also come to the town meeting who are not representatives, and they are trying to come and discuss all the issues, and they expect to be heard. So it's by no means everywhere in the United States or even in Canada that these traditions were really established, but they exist in a sort of theory that we have about our countries, that we are rooted in a tradition where everybody is part of the participation and they can actually help decide big issues. And one of the things that happens as cities and towns get bigger is that people miss the feeling of participation that they believe they used to have, even if in fact never did have anything of the sort. Advocacy planning, which you may know as a theory, is another ancestor of modern community participation. It was really formulated by Paul Davidoff, who was a professor at Hunter College of the City University of New York. And he wrote something called Advocacy and Pluralism in Planning, which was published back in 1965. And what he felt was that communities were being rolled over by governments, and that the community needed a planner who worked for them, and who would represent their issues. And he saw the planning process as essentially adversarial, that it was communities against the government. And what he did, he was a lawyer by training, and he saw this as a sort of a courtroom procedure. The problem is that nothing in his formulation actually said who was going to make the decision. And that has been a big problem with advocacy planning. Back in the mid-1960s, in 1966, the United States created something called originally demonstration cities as part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. And to get it through the Congress, it had to be changed to model cities. The original idea was to do just a few cities and demonstrate what would happen if you took social services and planning and united them and made them all part of one process. And what happened was that the money to do this was greatly diluted by making it apply in many more communities. However, there was a period where communities, where the government officials went out into the communities and actively engaged people in a lot of different issues. And a big part of it was making plans. And the participants in the plan were encouraged not to worry about resources. It was really, what do you think needs to happen in your community? And as a result of that, a great many community plans were made. But at the same time, the United States undertook a war in Southeast Asia, and many of the resources which might have gone to advocacy planning and to community participation in model cities went instead into the war effort. And when Richard Nixon became the president, he essentially cut the program back and eventually ended it. And the result of that was that these communities all had these plans, often very nicely produced and good-looking reports. And there's absolutely no money for implementation. And so the message was that the government had just engaged in a long process of fooling people. And in fact, didn't care about their views whatsoever. And that legacy of disillusionment is actually still there in many communities in the United States. Remembering back to 30, 40 years ago when they were promised a role and then nothing happened. So that is a really big, serious problem with community participation. If you're going to do it, you have to deliver. Because otherwise you've made the situation worse. But one of the things that we did learn from community participation was that it's actually an excellent method. And it's a way of learning more about what people in the community actually need and want. And it's a way of building a constituency to get things to happen. So many of us have done many plans. Joe Barrett is going to talk more about the quantity of plans that he's done using this method. They all start with a pretty similar outline, agreement about existing conditions. Because many people in the community don't really know what's going on in their own community. An overview of what are the things that you could actually do. Getting people to select an alternative, and then working out the details. And sometimes this really works. I was at a meeting in Norfolk, Virginia, and the mayor said to this whole group of people about this size, he said, does anybody here disagree with the plan Jonathan Barnett has presented? And one person in the back raised his hand and said, I don't agree. And the mayor said, you're outvoted. And that is sometimes how it works. The process also can be compressed into a 5 or 3 day workshop where you put all the planners and everybody who's working on the plan together with the community in one room. And you basically say, we're locking the door, you've got a deadline, you better have your result. And this can work. And often you break up into small groups, and then each group has a reporter and reports back to the whole meeting. There's a lot of engagement with the actual materials of planning, and you can see some of the body language of the people that not everybody is quite happy with this plan yet. This has become a kind of standard practice. This happens to be a slide that I found where one of the big issues is communicating. This is from a workshop in Dallas, where you are trying to communicate what the details of the plan are. Sometimes you invite people to the charrette and you give them a report at the end of the day. And it's become, as I said, a method. So this is actually a shot of Helsinki, Finland, when they were working on their 2050 plan. This looks more like what I would call community consultation rather than community participation. But certainly they're making everybody aware of what the plan is about. Now, I did want to say a few words about China because I've been going back and forth. I have very little knowledge of China, but I've been going there for 10 or 12 years, and I've observed some things. And I have heard about in Chongqing that they had a program where government was making improvements in local parks and the street beautification, and has convened many people in the community and asked them shown them alternatives, asked them what they would like. Also, there's a planner who has been who was one of the planners for the rebuilding of, I'm going to try pronouncing this, Yishu, in China after the earthquake. And he took me through inside the community participation process he went through with the property owners and restoring their houses, which the government was going to do, or did do. And it seemed to me a really good process. However, at the same time, we didn't discuss this, but the context of what he was doing is that the Chinese government essentially went into what had been a Tibetan style city and rebuilt it as a Chinese city. So there are a lot of complicated, it seems to me that it's easier in China to do consultation with communities on the smaller, more local issues, and not so easy to do it on the big, significant overall issues. Another factor which I think you ought to think about is that today with communication tools that we have, it's possible to involve large numbers of people in community participation. And one example was that after the terrorists destroyed the World Trade Center in 2001, the rebuilding process convened a meeting of more than 4,000 people in the New York City Convention Center. And the idea was that the people would be shown alternatives and they would vote on these alternatives and choose one, and then the process of rebuilding would go forward. So this is what the scene looked like, and this is what you would get if you were sitting in that room. These are the way you could look at the proposals. I'm going to show you the 6 proposals they were supposed to vote on. Here's 1, 2, okay, how are you going to vote? Well, as you can guess, what happened in the meeting was that people hated them all. Nothing got a vote. And as a result, the people actually, this is actually quite normal for those of us who've done community participation. Having a disaster as your first meeting is very usual. And because people need time to assimilate the idea that they're being consulted. And they come to the meeting with a lot of agendas, and some of them are quite hostile. And you just have to live through that. But instead, the people who were running the show gave up. They said, okay, we won't do community participation, we'll do an international competition. And they failed to consult the people who were actually going to build the new buildings. And in the end, the developer had the final say. It had little to do with either community participation or the architectural competition. So what can we learn from this? I think there are basically 6 points. First of all, it takes time. I think the community participation process takes about a year. And success in the participation is when people say, okay, we voted, please do something, stop talking to us. When that happens, you've been successful. When people are bored with participation, that's when you actually have done something. The community is also much larger than the neighbors. You need the people who are going to vote on it. You clearly, as is shown in the World Trade Center example, you need the people who are going to actually invest in it. And they have to be brought in. However, you can't bring all these same people in the same room at the same time. No real estate developer is going to tell you what he really wants to do if another real estate developer is sitting next to him. That's just never going to happen. And within the city council, there are a lot of cross currents and so forth. I need to explain that to you. And so you need, I think, a steering committee, because there's something they neglected to do with the World Trade Center where you have all those interests represented. And you need to hold individual meetings. You have to go call on each of the developers and say, what would you do if you had a choice? And so that's a lot of the homework that you have to do. You need to be able to make a decision. The real makers of the decision are probably the local government, but you also have to bring a participation process to a decision. And I did this in Omaha, and I have a couple minutes. The person running one of the people running the client group, the Omaha by Design, suggested that we give everybody in the audience 3 cards, one red, one yellow and one green, like a stoplight. And I said, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. This is like primary school. This will never work. But the fact is, it's a really good idea. So everybody in the room has these 3 cards. And I show you something. And you hold up your card. And if I'm standing here and I see a lot of green cards, I say, aha. You know, and the 2 or 3 red cards, I can call on them. And they are looking around and seeing that they are in the minority. You know, because in these participation meetings, there are often just 1 or 2 people who do all the talking. And the other people are sitting there saying, oh, but they're not allowed to say anything. So the cards actually bring out, you know, everybody's perfectly okay with holding up a card so that they, so you can see right away if there's hesitation, there's a lot of yellow cards. If there's really disagreement, there's a lot of red cards. If there are a lot of red cards, I say, well, we've obviously got to work on this. There's no more I need to say tonight. I will show you something different at the next meeting. And so that way you can actually, it's a facilitating method which actually can bring people to a decision. Now the charrette can actually be a way of shortening the process because you can get something that looks like a plan in 3 to 5 days. The difficulty is to do a charrette, you really need to plan it in advance. You need a lot of preliminary work. And then after the charrette, you've made all these sketches in 3 days, you have to go back and turn it into a plan. So it still takes a year, but you've saved money on bringing in your experts because you've gotten their full attention for 2 or 3 days, and then you just have to phone them and say, you know, we're doing this, is you still good with this? And then finally, which I think ought to be clear by now, the planner has to guide the process. I mean, the community participation is not going to produce a result if there isn't a structure given to it in the planning process. And that's a big responsibility for the planner. If you do it right, people won't even notice you're there, but they come out to your point of view in the end. Because let's face it, you have to have a sense of direction or you can't get any kind of decision. So Joe Barrett, who has done this many times, is going to now follow up on what I've said and show you a little bit more about how this works out in practice.
It's a great honor to follow Jonathan, I have to say, who is really is the dean of planners in North America. Et je voudrais bien dire un grand remercie à l'Université d'Ottawa. Benjamin, vous avez montré notre plan directeur pour l'Université d'Ottawa. Il faut dire que j'ai eu aucun rôle dans cette préparation, mais je suis très heureux de voir notre en place en train de construction à l'autre côté des fenêtres. Alors, voilà, je vais continuer en anglais. Peut-être que il me faut de l'assistance de mon collègue en Wolof. The first thing that I want to say is I do this for a living, community participation. And silly comment that I made to Jonathan on the plane up here. I try to calculate how many public meetings I've been to in my life. I mean, a working life of 35 years, and I calculated 753. So I've done this a bit, and so that's why I've got the word skeptical there. I run on. I loathe public involvement in principle, and I love it in practice. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. Can we make this? This is a project. Oh, back up. Okay, off we go. So this is the charrette. This is Mississauga Lakeview, a new community, a huge site just to the west of Toronto on the waterfront. What do we do? 2 3-day charrettes where we worked in public. The public kept coming in, going out, coming in, going out, and the politicians would come in, the developers would come in, go out, and it's a heck of a lot of fun, I have to say. You know, it's also a marvelous educational. We have school groups and everybody coming in and seeing us do this, and we try out all sorts of ideas that we thought about. We have wind vanes on the waterfront here, we have some high buildings here, and in come the community, and all of a sudden, suddenly those, they disappeared. What you're doing here is essentially using a physical model as a kind of essentially a teaching heuristic tool as to try and talk about what are complicated concepts. And one of the things you learn very rapidly when you go into communities is nobody can read a plan. The number of percentage of people in the world who can read a plan, about 5%. So it's planners think everybody understands when they put all these balls on a page about what it means, but they don't. So is this great? Yeah. Is it baloney? Yeah. It's about 2/3 of baloney. And the reason essentially is because there's sort of fundamental difficulties with this way of going through that any realistic planner has to deal with. Mississauga is a town of about 800,000 people. We really pushed here. We had 50 events over 2.5 years. We had 1,700 real people turn up. We had big social media stuff. We had about 7,000 hits. Okay, so that is a minuscule percentage. Earlier this week, 75% of the population of Mississauga voted in the election. We had less than 1%, if that, of people turning up to our events. That's a big problem. You got to understand that the people who turn up to these events, however hard you try, I loved all of the examples you're using about how you have to push this structurally. But the people who turn up are white, middle-aged homeowners. That's 95% of your ownership, of your audience. The difficulty is that on a project of this scale, where 6,000 people are going to live, 10, 15,000 people are going to work, where it's going to become a really significant economic resource for Mississauga, for the whole of the Greater Toronto region, is it reasonable to give that minuscule population such a weight in the determination of what should happen there? Because I'll tell you one thing, nobody in that room will live there. Nobody in that room will work there. It's a big problem. So it's a structural question that you have to deal with when you are, urban planning is a long process, years and years and years, decades. And you're building for the future. Who speaks for the future? So community is a word, it's sort of rather like, to be candid, sustainability and environment that has just got completely overloaded with baggage. So it's not a great word to use often. So you have to ask this question, who is community? That's the fundamental decision that anybody doing a large urban project has to ask. And what is your obligation to those who turn up, and what is your obligation to those who don't turn up? And as Carolyn was saying before, I actually think you have a much bigger obligation to those who don't turn up, and a much bigger obligation in the sense to those who haven't yet been informed. The classic community process is what I call a democracy of no. Yes, you can do a lot of charrettes and bring people along, and it's interesting. We fall in this language. Eventually, if you have enough meetings, people will realize that what you're telling them is the right thing to do. And frankly, what we do in a lot of our projects, if you have so many meetings, eventually the people who turn up, the homeowners, will kind of give up. So you can do whatever it is, it's the right thing to do. I'm being deliberately a bit provocative here because I was brought up with Shelley Arnstein, there's 8 levels of public consultation, and it's a, I don't know if this is a document that's still taught, beware what you wish for when you get up that level. So we've recently been working in a very, very poor community in Toronto, the Western neighborhood, which is up in the northwest of the city, and it's having a big GO line and a big, it's where the Union Pearson Express, the airport line goes through. So we're doing a lot of consultation with them. Again, one of the issues in this area is a big Somali community. This is a big, a lot of unemployment, a lot of the youth gangs, all kinds of stuff like that. Again, it's the homeowners who turn up. However hard you work, those will be who turn up. And they demanded some very, very expensive changes in the design. They actually wanted to move a station from Eglinton up to Lawrence, which cost about $200 million. They wanted a pedestrian bridge, frankly, to nowhere, which would cost about $15 million. And they also refused to entertain any idea that the absolute core sites right next to the station should be developed for anything intense, so they stole the value from those. Now, this is democracy, small group democracy working. The trouble is the politicians who represent them, as you know, in civic elections, next to nobody votes. Anybody who's in power essentially has an enormous advantage because you can win on about 10% of the vote. So they have a huge advantage. And in most councils, the council is unwilling to override the local alderman, councillor. Frankly, both those very expensive things happened. There was also a very good thing which happened, which was a kind of art, cultural workspace training center for about 20 million. But we spent in the community meetings close to 300 million of public money in a very undemocratic way. So what you create in a lot of these circumstances is frankly power without responsibility, which is the very thing that community participation is supposed to act against. So essentially you have big legitimacy questions that are, I think, raised, but they're also very big practical questions. Because in a sense, you subvert formal democracy. I mean, typically in a municipal election here, you get about a third turnout. That's a heck of a lot more people who come to public meetings. And so you ask yourself the question, at what scale should these decisions, these expensive decisions, be made? And again, you have to be very worried if you were a genuine community Democrat about what people want when you go out to community meetings, because it's very clear what they don't want. They don't want high-rise buildings. They don't want intensification. They don't want mixed use. They don't want traffic. They don't want lots of strange people coming into their area. What they do want is more parking, more shopping, but no shops. And they all want stuff. They all want more parks, more schools, more community centers, more. And so you have to have a fantastically good filter on this as a professional. You know, what is the reasonable ask here? What is the reasonable level of density? I know, chatting to the planner, this partner in my office who is responsible for this, the border street. Where does the university end and where does the community begin? Now, is that just a local issue, or is this such a generator of wealth and education and innovation for the university that, frankly, don't hold it back? That's a question very tough to ask in the community world. I think the next point I want to make, in the interest of moving along, is that expertise is very important. I don't believe that community planning is essentially just representing community opinion. I don't think we all go to school and get huge student debt in order to become a kind of community recording machine. There is actually some kind of science to planning. It's a very soft science. It's only a science. I love the expression of David Foote, the University of Toronto demographer, and he says anything in the social sciences is about 2/3 true. And any planning proposition is no more than 2/3 true. But I think there nonetheless are some important propositions, and that's what is our professional role, is essentially to advance those. The most successful project that I've been involved in recently is the radical remaking of the Toronto waterfront, which I hope you all have a chance to see, because essentially what happened there, the Toronto waterfront, with about 1,500 acres of waterfront prime land, and lots of failed attempts to get it going. A three-party federal, provincial, municipal agency was set up to oversee what was happening there. And very cleverly, Toronto Waterfront created, frankly, a fourth level of government, which was a community level of government. And they have the most formally structured community participation of any big agency. There are steering committees set up on every project of interest groups. There are lots of public meetings, lots of shirts, lots of workshops. What this has actually oddly been able to do is to advance the importance of expertise, because essentially you have four levels of government. They all kind of cancel each other out. So the strongest, most sensible words that are said are those that are said by the professionals. And it's a don't misunderstand, underestimate the Machiavellian quality of all urban planners. The other thing that has to be said is don't also understand the total conflict of interest that all urban planners are in, because we're going to have another public meeting, or we won't have a charrette. I mean, it's I hate to use the picture because I can't do that after the last election. But we make a ton of money as a firm out of community participation, and a lot of the interest groups involved, quite frankly, have that slight conflict. So what Waterfront Toronto have done is essentially they've done what I would call top-down planning, expert planning. If you go there, you'll see it's brilliantly made, beautiful stuff, meeting all of the social, environmental, sustainability targets that it should. But they built in what I would call a kind of insurance policy. They built in we think this is right, the other levels of government are too busy fighting with each other, so they don't really know what's going on. So we will talk to the community, and if it makes sense to them, it makes sense to go forward. So it's a planning with a kind of safety check, and I think that's the way that we should actually properly construct how we think about community involvement. Because ultimately, building cities is not art, not only art. It's basically about land, money, power, and vision. And this sounds awful hard-ass, but it's exactly what Jonathan was saying with respect to the 9/11 World Trade Center process. Ultimately, one landowner owned that land. If you didn't engage with him, you were kidding yourself. Owned the development rights. And the other thing is that urban development is incredibly expensive. You're talking in tens, hundreds of millions. These are not casual decisions that you make. They're not casual decisions that any government can make. They're incredibly expensive things. So again, the notion that a design charrette that can, you put all these arrows that go running across somebody's private land. Well, there's something called the Planning Act. You can't do that. We all may say, that this property is theft, but property in this country is very carefully controlled, and its rights are controlled. So every time you put a mark on that plan, you are basically spending money. What I always like to say is that in any planning exercise, it's the horizontal, the parks, the roads, the water's edge promenades that cost the money, pipes in the street. It's the vertical, the development opportunity that creates the money. So any urban design planning exercise is basically a three-dimensional cash flow exercise. And that's really, you have to think of it in those terms. If you want to be a real person making good places in the city, you have to engage with land, money, power, and vision. Does it work? This is the awful question. Do you get better things as a result of community participation? I don't want to be a Grinch here, but I think you get as much good as you get bad. I've had the great pleasure of working a couple of projects where there was absolutely no community involvement at all. When in Manchester, after the big IRA bombing just blew the whole city centre to pieces, we had to get that up and running incredibly quickly. And the city of Manchester and the national government were marvelous. They insisted the best people be hired, with the best expertise be used. They suspended the Planning Act, they suspended the environmental acts, everything. They just said, you will use best practice. You will do this really well. And it was constructed incredibly quickly, and I think most people regard it as being one of the best city centre reconstructions in the UK, if not Europe. We'd have the occasional chat with people, but frankly, it was there wasn't any large-scale public participation. So that's an exceptional circumstance, and it's not going to happen, God willing, here. But the more worrisome thing is, and what I see the cities that are in the lead now doing, is they are worrying about big things. They're worrying about economic viability. They're worrying about education, higher research activities. They're worried about the communications, connectivity, airports, about about the attractiveness of the city centers, because I think there's been a little bit of a seduction. Urban design can end up really being a decorative art if you're not careful. Cities are actually driven by pretty strong, powerful underlying forces, and a real city engages with those underlying forces. So when again, working a bit in London, seeing what's going on in Paris, working a bit in New York, Manchester, Calgary, and Edmonton, I think right now, and increasingly Toronto, there's much more of a concern about getting these big things to happen. And the wonderful Jane Jacobs didn't give us a clue about how to do big things. And so all of planning education is essentially focused on a person who said the tactile quality of the street is the essence of a city. It is, but it is not actually the driver of a city. And so it's really sensible that the city has to make sure that it is actually engaging with those deep forces. So, having said all that, you've got to do it anyhow. So you might as well enjoy it. And I find, frankly, as a professional planner, as I say, everybody tells me I got to go to a public meeting. I go, oh, God, listen to those people moaning on. It's so much fun. It is really great. And it is also that absolutely critical safety check, which only I think our profession has. Doctors don't have people going in their ears like this. Lawyers, I wish they did have people going in their ears like this. But as public professionals, you have to play in public. And it is a hugely humbling, hugely educational, hugely rewarding process. But I'll leave you with one marvelous quote. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, U.S. Supreme Court Justice, she asked, what's the essential quality that a Supreme Court Justice has to have? She spoke a minute and she said, well, it's a bit like a long and successful marriage. It helps to be a little bit deaf. Thank you.
So we are running very short of time, but I think it would be unfair not to offer the opportunity for a question or two. So I'm going to turn these over to the audience. If you'd like to ask a question to either of our or any of our presenters, please feel free to. And thank you very much for all the enlightening and enjoyable conversations. I should say that part of the goal here today was to sort of, and I think part of what's humbling for us here in Canada when we're thinking about what's going on in China and Africa is to realize, again, as Carolyn said, the small scale at which we operate, but this overall sense that that we've sort of figured it out, having gone through urbanization a century earlier. What we wanted to kind of give you all with this view into the workings of a mature democracy is to a sense of how inefficient, remarkably inefficient it is when it comes to solving big problems. There are those of us who go to China and see what has been accomplished there in such a short time and come back and pull our hair out that we're so unable to accomplish anything within the context of private property and mature democracies. So as economies mature, as political systems mature, you mature toward this messiness that we've tried to describe today, and that's part of the conversation we wanted to have. Yes.
I have a question for Jonathan Gordon and Joe Barrett. So I just enjoyed very much the presentation just made on community sustainability and planning. So is this model happening in Canada, in your view, because you talk about land, power, money and vision, how do you think, I don't know, some of you have been working before, visiting some developing countries, such as Africa. Is there any advice, I'm talking practical advice, because many things are happening based on the model you're describing. Could you really advise these countries to do now? Because this is all are searching for solution and alternatives. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just start quickly. I have to say that I'm working in Singapore and I'm working in Hong Kong. That's my extent of working outside of the developed world. what I see, and our firm is working in a lot of other places, and what I think I see is, in a sense, that developing countries, for a lot of the reasons we described earlier, just embraced a model of urbanism that was, in a sense, convenient and quick, and they could push it out because they thought the biggest challenge was how do we accommodate people, how do we accommodate urbanization, how do we get homes built. This is not so dissimilar to Europe after the war, when a huge number of very well-intentioned social community council housing projects were developed, and with very much the same architectural model, and they've all proven to be a disaster. What I suspect is that you may be just on a turn of the wheel, you know, there is a science to planning. There are things you should and shouldn't do, and if you have your foot on the Radiant City Le Corbusier gas pedal, you're going to get in trouble. But it takes people perhaps collectively a little while to figure that out.
I've had a few opportunities to observe the planning process in China and to also to work with students in China. And I think it's a very delicate question to raised by community participation, because China is in a transitional period, and the government is working out just how much participation they can handle from different people in the society. And, you know, whatever our views are, it's not relevant to what the decisions are that have to be made in China. What I've observed is that consultation as opposed to participation. What I see is that people in China are extremely well briefed on what's happening in other countries, and their education system is very good. And so it's not the planners in China don't know about community participation. So the question is, to what extent are they able to try it out? Yeah. And the answer, I think, has been, or the couple of examples that I knew about and mentioned, is that they can consult. And at the local level, in China, you have a tradition which is, I don't know enough about it to really characterize it, but you have the village as a tradition, and the village has various democratic processes which are, I imagine, quite outspoken. I've never been to a village meeting, but I bet people speak their minds in it, up to a point in any case. So there is a tradition in the country of local decision making, and there are ways of trying to build that in. The larger big political question, how to make big decisions, is a whole different matter. Unfortunately, I can't answer the question about Africa at all, because I've not been there, except as a tourist and don't know anything about it.
The back with the turtleneck.
Une question pour Caroline. Tu as parlé d'une grande coalition, finalement, à travers les deux mouvements que tu as présentés. Si on prend l'idée de systématiser d'une certaine façon la participation dont Jonathan Barnett a parlé, comment vous gérez toutes ces parties prenantes dans ces deux cas-là? C'est des gens qui s'organisent de façon spontanée avec une direction ambiguë, ou s'il y a vraiment quelque chose qui organise une coalition derrière?
Je dirais que je ne parle pas des réunions du public, je parle d'une série de petites actions qui se passent dans différents lieux, comme la façon de faire pas une coalition, mais de façon de faire la planification avec les Somalis c'était de faire en sorte qu'il y ait des jeunes Somaliens qui vont à l'université ou qui vont au collège. Et donc, c'est beaucoup plus long terme, si vous voulez, que les processus de planification communautaire. Et je suis plus qu'entièrement d'accord. Moi, j'ai été à plein des réunions où je suis arrivée à Ottawa avec la planification de la Côte de Sable et de Basseville, et ces deux expériences qui montrent que la Basseville s'était ruinée par la planification. et le Côte de Sable, parce qu'ils avaient toutes sortes d'expertise dans la communauté, a très bien réussi avec la planification. Mais je pense de différence est un peu, je ne parle pas d'une réunion, des réunions, et des processus de gouvernance compliqués dans tous ces processus, où souvent une partie, si on parle de la ville pour tout le temps, il y a des processus de table de discussion, mais de multi. Et donc, je ne parle pas d'un processus unique de planification très complexe, très long terme, et pas dans un certain sens, et j'aurais dû être plus clair dans ça, pas dans un sens comme la planification, dans le sens et il y a beaucoup de place dans tous ces deux projets où il y a des urbanistes qui prennent des décisions et qui jouent un rôle, mais c'est pas un processus de planification dans le sens traditionnel, ou dans le sens exact de la planification. Je ne sais pas si ça répond.
One more question, all the way in the back.
Thanks for excellent presentations, which I found generally convincing, and I love, Professor Andrew, your idea of the city for women, inclusion of all women, and so forth. I appreciate very much the skepticism of the last speaker and the bits of honesty. I was struck, however, that a few words were never mentioned in any presentation. Rights were never mentioned. The law was never mentioned. So these things don't take place in the absence of these. And the third word, which never came up, which I think is actually critical to this, is competition. Because it seemed implicit in all three presentations, the idea of, or at least an ethos of cooperation, if not collaboration. But my sense is that inclusion, for example, or participation, implicitly raises the idea of competitors. I think, Mr. Burge, you hinted at it in conflict of interest. Well, it's more than conflict of interest, right? There are real competitors for resources, for wealth, and so forth. So my question to the panel is, how would you imagine this being effectively pursued in light of competition? Which I don't suggest is a necessary opposite evil or anything like that. It has positive attributes. But how would you reconcile it with competition?
Those of you in the audience who are trained in architecture or engineering are familiar with something called the resolution of forces diagram, in which you have, it's often shown with arrows. You show an entity, and then there's an arrow pulling in one direction, there's an arrow pulling in another direction. The direction the entity actually moves is the resolution of all of those different competing directions. So that planning is, of course, an extremely easy process. That is, if you ask me how to design a city, I can sit down and design a city. That's not the problem. The problem is getting other people to agree with you. And of course, within the context of law, and in the context of equity, all of which we understand we operate in, you have these competing factors, and one of the jobs, I think, of the planner is to help these different forces become articulate, and which is why you need the planner to work with communities, and also to moderate some of the forces which are overbearing, and and help guide the resolution of all these forces in a direction which you professionally think is the right direction. With Joe's caveat that, of course, that's the planner's view, and the planner has a rather tiny force in the resolution of forces, but it's there.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. All social resources are in short supply. So when I gave that example of the community demanding that a station be moved and that various things happened and that you ended up with a big bill, nobody ever counted like that. But ultimately, those numbers do get back to public budgets, and they're serious numbers. And I think we should never underestimate the importance, the fundamental importance of formal politics. Formal politics, formal democracy is the legitimate form of government. Community meetings are not. Community processes are not. Community processes essentially are there, in my mind, to be a corrective, a push, a pressure, a force. informal democracy. But if you are deciding who's going to spend 300 million of public money, that's a formal public decision. And I think we have obscured that too often in public debate. It's almost a kind of a bazaar-like quality, not bazaar, that when you go to a public meeting, what would you like, community? Well, I think, it ain't so simple. So I think it always saddens me that such a small percentage of people turn out to municipal politics elections than do to federal. Because in terms of your quality of life, in many ways it's the local level which is most significant.
Great.
I would just also add to that the reason that all my partnerships include the City of Ottawa is exactly your point, that the aim is to bring the city to understand, or the aim is to include the city. And I completely agree, formal politics is extremely important.
Great, thank you for the very probing questions. Please join me in thanking our panel this morning. I think I speak for the organizers by saying we're on quite a tight schedule here. We are meant to, I think, serve ourselves lunch and be back in this room in about 5 minutes for more presentations, so we need to get to it.